In a dark, damp basement, a wounded K-9 soldier lay dying. He was muzzled, chained, and snarled at anyone who came near. His former Navy SEAL partner was bound and helpless. But one woman, a fellow hostage, saw the soul behind the pain. With her last cup of water, she risked her life for an animal she didn't know. What happened next was a miracle that would break your heart and restore your faith and courage. The air in the forgotten Pennsylvania steel town hung cold and heavy, like a wool blanket soaked in rust and decay. It was past midnight, but the biting autumn chill of the Allegheny Mountains offered no comfort, only a deeper sense of isolation. The moon was a sliver, a shard of bone in a black sky. On a gravel-strewn rooftop overlooking a dark, skeletal factory, Jake Callahan lay motionless. Known as Saint to his team, Jake was a man whose broad shoulders and steady gaze seemed built to carry the very burdens his call sign implied. He scanned the perimeter through his night vision goggles, the world painted in ghostly shades of green and black. Beside him, equally still, was Bear, a magnificent sable-coated German shepherd. Bear was Jake's partner. To the untrained eye, he was a weapon. To Jake, he was an anchor, a shadow, a breathing extension of his own senses. Bear's breathing was low and even, the only sign of life the slow flare of his nostrils as he tasted the dead air. Jake's calm crackled, a whisper of static. Alpha 1, this is Ghost. Eyes on. 2 sentries, east perimeter. Static, no movement. The voice belonged to Ghost, the team sniper, a lean, patient man who seemed carved from the same industrial decay he now hid within, perched on a water tower 500 yards away. Copy, Ghost, Jake murmured, his voice barely disturbing the silence. He tapped the arm of the man beside him. Gadget. 2 minutes. Gadget, the team's tech expert, nodded. He was a compact man, a bundle of focused energy, his fingers always fiddling with some wire or device. He gave Jake a simple thumbs up. Their team was small, efficient, and they trusted each other with their lives. Tonight, that trust was being wagered on rescuing a group of volunteer clinic workers. While they waited for Ghost's next update, Jake used the stillness to review the objective on his wrist-mounted display. The faces of the hostages stared back at him, grainy and haunted. His gaze lingered on one file, Dr. Anya Sharma. The ID photo showed a woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with kind, intelligent eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw that seemed to defy the sterile light of the camera flash. Dr. Anya Sharma, the file read, internist, volunteers in medicine. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained for this. Yet, according to the intel, she had refused to abandon her post when the local militia, a radical anti-government group, had taken over the town's community center. My patients are here, her last unsecured text had said. So I am, too. Jake felt a strange twist of admiration. It was the kind of courage that got people killed. It was also the kind of courage that reminded him what they were fighting for. He felt an abstract, protective pull for this woman he had never met, a woman who chose to stay when every sane instinct screamed to run. A soft pressure brought him back to the rooftop. Bear had shifted, pressing his heavy head against Jake's arm. It was a simple gesture, reassurance, a silent, I am here. I am ready. The familiar weight and warmth of his partner sent Jake's mind tumbling back 3 years, not to a crumbling factory, but to a dusty training facility in Texas. Jake had been broken then. The Navy called it operational stress after the Helmand incident. A bad call, a compromised position. 2 men lost. Jake called it failure. He had been honorably discharged, adrift, and his former commander, trying to save a good man from himself, had suggested he work with a service dog organization for veterans. He remembered walking the concrete run, the air ringing with the sound of powerful, aggressive dogs, perfect military assets. Then he saw a kennel in the back. A sable shepherd, not the largest or the loudest, was sitting quietly, watching him. This dog wasn't barking or jumping. He was just observing with an intelligence that felt unsettlingly human. The handler, a grizzled former Marine, had seen him stop. That one, he's smart, the man had said, sighing. Maybe too smart. Doesn't test high on the aggression metrics. He's sensitive. Hates the kennel. Jake, moving in a fog of his own grief, had ignored the warning. He knelt by the chain link. The dog didn't bark. He stood, walked calmly to the gate, and pushed his nose through the diamond-shaped gap. He made a low, soft sound, a whine that didn't sound like a plea, but like a question. Jake had put his hand flat against the wire. The dog pressed his wet nose into Jake's palm, sniffing once before licking the salt from his skin. In that instant, Jake felt the first crack in the emotional ice that had encased his heart for months. This animal wasn't assessing him as a handler or a threat. He was acknowledging his pain. This dog didn't see a failed seal. He just saw a man who was hurting. "He's the one," Jake had said, his voice rough. "Callahan," the handler had started. "He's not exactly. He's the one." Jake had named him Bear. And in the months that followed, as Jake trained the dog, it was Bear who had retrained the man. Bear had saved him, taught him to trust again. First to trust the dog, then his team, and finally, slowly, to trust himself. Bear hadn't just been chosen. He had chosen right back. A click in his ear snapped Jake back to the Pennsylvania night. "Saint, Ghost. Sentries are moving. West corner, looks like a shift change. You have a window. Go." "On the move," Jake breathed. He gave the silent hand signal. Gadget and the other two members of their ad hoc team melted from their positions. Jake and Bear took the lead. They moved like ghosts through the alleys, shattered glass crunching softly under their boots. The skeletal remains of mills and warehouses rose around them. The only sound was the distant, mournful whistle of the wind through broken windows. Bear was in his element, nose down, ears swiveling, tasting the air for any scent that was out of place. Sweat, tobacco, gun oil. They reached the target building, an old smelting plant. Its high, windowless walls offered only one obvious point of entry, a large roll-up door and a smaller steel door beside it. Jake motioned for the team to halt, taking cover in the deep shadow of an adjacent ruined structure. He watched the plant. It was quiet. Too quiet. There were no voices, no generators, no smoke, just the oppressive silence of the autumn night. Jake gave the signal to stack up. Gadget moved to the steel door, pulling a small fiber optic scope to check beneath it. Jake stood just behind him, Bear at his side, his hand resting lightly on the dog's back. Suddenly, Bear froze. It wasn't a dramatic movement. It was a complete cessation of movement. His body went rigid, every muscle locked, his head lowered, and a low, almost inaudible growl rumbled deep in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was a growl of certainty. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew that growl. It meant the danger wasn't near. It was here. He raised a closed fist, the universal signal for stop. "Ambush." Ghost's voice, suddenly tight and urgent, came over the comm. "Saint, I've lost the sentries. They didn't move off. They just vanished from my scope." Jake looked down at Bear. The dog's hackles were raised, a stiff ridge from his neck to his tail. He was staring intently at the impenetrable darkness of the main factory doorway. The silence that followed was louder, heavier, and more terrifying than any explosion. The growl from Bear's chest was a low-frequency vibration that Jake felt more than heard. It was the sound of certainty. Before Jake could even process the warning, before he could whisper, "Abort," the night exploded. Blinding industrial-grade floodlights snapped on from the rooftops of the plant, instantly turning the alley into a perfectly illuminated killing floor. The oppressive silence was shattered by a deafening wall of sound. Muzzle flashes erupted from three sides: the plant roof, the buildings across the alley, and horrifyingly, from the rubble behind them. Ghost's vanished sentries hadn't left. They had been the bait to draw them in. "Ambush, ambush!" Jake roared, his voice cracking over the din. "Fall back! Cover! Gadget, smoke!" But there was nowhere to fall back to. They were caught in a perfectly executed three-sided trap. The air was alive with the sharp snap of rounds passing too close and the thwack of bullets biting into the brick and concrete they scrambled behind. The small, broken wall they used for cover was disintegrating under the heavy fire. Their heavy weapons specialist returned fire in long, desperate bursts, but he was shooting at ghosts. Gadget cursed, a sharp intake of breath, and Jake saw him clutch his leg. "Doc, Gadget is hit." Jake yelled, his tactical mind trying to impose order on the chaos. But beneath the tactical assessment, a cold, familiar dread was creeping in. This wasn't the fear of dying. It was the icy grip of failure. His gaze flickered between Gadget, who was now being dragged behind better cover, and the others, who were desperately trying to suppress the rooftop positions. "I did this. I walked them into this." The faces of the two men he'd lost in Helmand flashed before his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the bullets. He was terrified of the silence that would come after, the silence of having led his men, his brothers, to their deaths. "Saint! Flanker left!" Ghost screamed over the comm. Jake spun. Emerging from a darkened doorway they had already passed, a large, bearded man, his eyes wide with adrenaline, was leveling his rifle. He was too close. Jake tried to swing his own weapon, but the man was faster. Time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing to the dark, lethal circle of the enemy's muzzle. He was too late. But Bear was not. A 90-pound blur of sable fur and trained muscle exploded from Jake's side. Bear had been trained to neutralize, not to kill. But in this moment, he was a guardian. He launched himself high, hitting the gunman squarely in the chest. The impact was brutal. There was a sickening thud of bodies colliding, a choked-off shout, and the man's rifle discharged harmlessly into the sky as he and the dog crashed back into the alley. Bear had saved his life. Bear, heal. Now. Jake yelled, his heart seizing in his chest. Bear scrambled off the downed fighter and spun to return to Jake. In that split second, a new sound tore through the air, a sharp crack followed by a deafening whump. An improvised explosive device, triggered remotely. It had landed short, just meters from Bear. The blast wave threw Jake against the wall. Shrapnel, hot and sharp, shredded the air. Bear was flung sideways like a rag doll, slamming into the concrete wall with a high, agonized yelp. That sound, it was a sound Jake had prayed he would never hear. It shattered his training. It shattered his focus. The battle, the ambush, the mission, it all evaporated. There was only the dog. Bear. He screamed, his voice raw. He scrambled on his hands and knees, ignoring the round still impacting the wall above him. He reached Bear, who was lying on his side, his body convulsing. His hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a dark, spreading stain of blood matted his fur. He was trying to get up, whining in pain and confusion. "No, buddy. No, it's okay. I'm here." Jake's hands hovered over the wound, useless, trembling. His mind, usually so clear, was a fog of pure, undiluted panic. This wasn't a soldier. This was his partner. This was Bear. "Doc, I need." He never finished the sentence. His absolute, desperate focus on Bear had made him blind. He never heard the scrape of the boot on the gravel behind him. He only registered a shadow moving into his peripheral vision, and then a hard, violent impact against the back of his helmet. The world didn't go black. It flared into a painful, shimmering white, and then, mercifully, nothing at all. The first thing to return was the sound. A slow, rhythmic drip. 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 The second was the smell. Rust, mildew, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold fear. Jake's head felt like it had been cracked open, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from the base of his skull. He tried to move his hands. They were bound, the plastic zip ties cutting deep into his wrists. He forced his eyes open. Darkness. A cold, damp floor beneath him. As his vision slowly adjusted, the shapes in the gloom became horribly clear. He was in a large cellar. Gadget was slumped against the far wall, his leg crudely bandaged. The rest of his team was beside him, bound and bruised. Ghost was there, too, his face grim. His entire team, captured. Then his eyes searched the darkness frantically. "Bear," he croaked. He saw him in a dark corner, lying on his side. Bear was breathing, his flanks rising and falling in shallow, pained gasps. A tight, heavy canvas muzzle was strapped over his snout, and his hind leg was wrapped in a dirty, blood-soaked rag. As Jake watched, Bear let out a low, broken whine, a sound of utter misery. A heavy metal door scraped open, flooding the cellar with a harsh yellow light and throwing them all into sharp relief. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. He stepped inside. He was not a large man, but he moved with an unnerving, predatory grace. He was meticulous, precise, wearing clean tactical gear. This was Marcus Thorne. His face was angular, intelligent, and held a look of cold, academic curiosity. He looked over the captured men as if they were specimens. Thorne's gaze stopped on Jake. Then it drifted to the corner, to the wounded dog. A thin, cruel smirk touched his lips. "The infamous heroes of Coronado," Thorne said, his English perfect, smooth as polished stone. "And your remarkable animal." He clicked his tongue softly. "It seems the federal lions have been declawed." Thorne held their gaze for one long, cold moment, his thin smile never wavering. He seemed to savor their defeat, breathing it in like fine wine. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stepped out. The heavy steel door scraped shut, and the sound of a thick wooden bar dropping into its iron brackets echoed in the sudden darkness. The yellow light was gone, replaced by a blackness so complete it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down on them. Jake lay still, taking inventory. The throbbing in his head was a roaring fire, but his training cut through it. Breathe. Assess. He could hear Gadget groan, a low, pained sound. "My leg," Gadget whispered, his voice tight. "Doc." "I know," a calm voice replied nearby. It was their medic, a man who had seen everything and was rarely rattled. Just keep the pressure on. Don't move. Ghost and the others were silent, but Jake could hear their breathing. Steady. Controlled. They were professionals. They were alive. But they were not alone. As Jake's vision slowly adapted, the absolute blackness softened into shades of deep gray. The cellar was vast, the air smelling of mildew, damp earth, and human fear. From the far corner, he heard another sound, one that did not belong to his team. It was the high, thin sound of quiet, terrified sobbing. He strained his eyes. Against the far wall, a cluster of shadows huddled together. The civilian hostages, the mission objective. Now they were all just cargo in the same dark hold. Jake's gaze swept the group, assessing. Most were frozen, heads bowed in prayer or despair. But one figure was moving. It was a woman kneeling, her back to him. He watched as she leaned over another person who was lying curled on the floor. It hurts. It hurts, the person on the floor whimpered. It was an older woman, her voice frail. He just shoved me. I think it's broken. Shh, I know. It's okay, Eleanor. Just hold still, a second voice said. It was calm, firm, and somehow warm. It sliced through the cold despair of the room. Jake shifted, the movement sending a jolt of fire through his bound wrists. The kneeling woman turned her head slightly, giving him a view of her profile. It was her, the face from the intel file. Dr. Anya Sharma. She was dirt-streaked and pale, her hair matted, but her eyes, even in the gloom, were sharp and focused. She was speaking to Eleanor Vance, an older, gray-haired woman who worked as the clinic's administrator. Eleanor was clutching her forearm, which was bleeding from a nasty gash. We have to stop the bleeding, Eleanor, Anya said, her voice a soothing balm. We can't let it get infected in here. Jake watched, amazed, as Anya grabbed the hem of her own thin cotton blouse. With 2 strong, practiced rips, she tore a long, clean strip of fabric away. She began to wrap the older woman's arm, her movements efficient, her hands sure. She was not a panicked hostage. She was a doctor at work. As she tied the knot, she looked up, as if sensing his stare. Her eyes found his across the shadows. They locked. Jake saw no plea for help, no terror, no accusation. He just saw recognition, a weary acknowledgement of the impossible situation they shared. She saw him, a soldier bound and defeated. He saw her, a healer still fighting. In that silent, shared glance, a fragile, unspoken alliance was formed. She held his gaze for a second more, then turned back to Eleanor, whispering, "There, that's better." The moment shattered as a low, agonizing sound came from the corner to Jake's right. A muffled whine. There. Jake's heart clenched. He turned his head, the pain in his skull forgotten. His partner was chained by the neck to a thick iron ring set in the wall. The canvas muzzle was strapped cruelly tight, and his wounded hind leg was stretched out, trembling violently. As Bear saw Jake watching, his tail gave one weak, desperate thump against the stone floor. He whined again, a sound of pure misery and confusion trapped behind the muzzle. The guilt that had been simmering in Jake's gut now erupted, choking him. This is my fault. I brought you here. I failed you. He remembered the kennel. He remembered Bear pressing his nose into his hand, trusting him instantly. He was a SEAL. He was the protector, the handler, the shield. And he had failed. He had let his partner walk into a trap, get wounded, and now this, the chain, the muzzle, the trembling. It was an image of pure, agonizing helplessness. He couldn't stand it. He had to check the wound. He had to let him know he wasn't alone. Bear, he whispered, his voice cracking. It's okay, boy. I'm coming. Ignoring the fire in his wrists and the pounding in his head, Jake began to drag himself across the floor on his elbows, pushing with his boots. He was a snake, broken and bound. He only made it 3 feet. The steel door, which he thought had been barred, scraped open again. The harsh yellow light flooded the room, blinding them. A guard, a large, thick-necked man with a bored, brutal face, was silhouetted in the doorway. He had clearly been watching them through a peephole. The guard's eyes landed on Jake, then on the dog. He saw the attempt. He stepped inside. He's hurt, Jake said, his voice level, trying to sound authoritative, even from the floor. He's a service animal. He needs. The guard didn't speak. He just walked over to Jake, his footsteps heavy. Jake tensed, bracing for a kick, but the guard was focused on his objective, separating the man from the dog. He swung the butt of his rifle in a short, vicious arc. It wasn't aimed at Jake's head. It was aimed at his shoulder, right near the collarbone. The hard steel and plastic struck with a sickening thud. A jolt of white-hot agony shot through Jake's entire upper body, stealing his breath. He cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound, and collapsed, his arm going numb. The guard looked down at him, his face impassive. He nudged Jake's ribs with his boot, a simple, non-verbal warning. Stay down. Then he turned, walked out of the cellar, and this time the heavy thud of the crossbar locking into place was final. The yellow light vanished. The darkness that returned was absolute. The cell was silent for a long moment, broken only by Jake's ragged, pained breathing. Then, from the corner, Bear's muffled, desperate whine began again. And from the other side of the room, Eleanor Vance's soft, hopeless sobs joined the awful chorus. The air in the cell grew thick and cold, heavy with the suffocating weight of despair. Hours bled into a gray, hopeless dawn that filtered through a single tiny grate high in the cellar wall. The air was cold, but the humidity of their breath and the stench of fear made it feel thick and suffocating. The routine was established quickly. It was one of calculated neglect. Twice a day, the heavy bar on the door would scrape back, and the same large, brutal guard would enter. He never spoke. His presence was enough. On the first morning, he threw a small burlap sack onto the floor. It landed with a dry thud. Inside was stale, hard bread, dry as rock. The hostages scrambled for it, their dignity evaporating in the face of hunger. The SEALs, trained to endure, took their portions last, their faces grim. The water was worse. The guard would fill a single filthy bucket from a tap just outside the cell. Jake could hear the squeal of the pipes. He'd ladle one small tin cup of brackish water for each person. It was just enough to keep them alive. It was not enough to quench their thirst. Jake's world had shrunk to the space he occupied on the floor. His shoulder was a universe of fire. The guard's rifle butt had done its job well. He couldn't lift his left arm, and every breath sent a jolt of agony through his collarbone. But that pain was distant. His true focus, his true agony, was in the corner. Bear was a portrait of misery. The tight muzzle kept him from panting, from barking, from licking his wound. His hind leg was clearly broken, and the dirty rag was soaked through. He had refused to move, lying in the same spot, his breath hitching. But he was not silent. A low, constant vibration rumbled in his chest. It was a growl of pure pain, fear, and warning. He growled when the hostages near him sobbed. He growled when the guards came in. He growled at Jake, a sound of utter confusion, as if to ask why his master hadn't fixed this. When the guard brought the morning meal, a piece of bread landed near Bear's corner. Gadget, his own leg propped against the wall, tried to nudge it closer to the dog with his good foot. Bear's growl deepened, becoming a snarl that echoed off the stone. Easy, boy, Gadget muttered, pulling his foot back. Just trying to help. Don't, Jake said, his voice a low rasp. He's not himself. He's trapped. He'll lash out. Jake knew his dog. Bear was trained to only accept food from his handler. To him, all others were a potential threat, especially now when he was wounded and defenseless. The muzzle meant to control him was now a source of torture, turning his fear into defensive aggression. The hostages gave Bear a wide, terrified berth, all except one. Anya Sharma had received her portion, one crust of bread and one cup of water. She sat watching, her gaze moving from Jake's pale, sweat-streaked face to the suffering animal. Jake watched her. He saw her look at the dry bread in her hand. Then at her own precious cup of water. He saw the exact moment the decision was made. Don't, dear, Eleanor Vance, the older woman, whispered from her spot against the wall. He's not a pet. He's a weapon. He'll bite you. Anya didn't seem to hear. She stood up slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. She began to walk toward the corner where Bear lay. The growl intensified immediately. It became a deep, thoracic rumble, the last defense of a cornered animal. Bear, no. Jake tried to command, but his voice was weak, and Bear was too consumed by his own pain. Anya stopped about 10 feet away. She didn't approach him head-on. She turned her body slightly, making herself smaller, less threatening. She did not look him in the eyes. Instead, she knelt, her gaze soft, fixed on his wounded leg. I know, she whispered, her voice so low Jake could barely hear it. I know it hurts. You're such a good boy, such a brave boy. Bear's growl faltered for just a second, confused by the tone. It was not the voice of a threat. It was not the voice of a master. It was just kind. Then Anya did something that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. She took her hard crust of bread and, with slow, deliberate movements, she dipped it into her own small tin cup. She soaked the bread in her entire ration of water, turning the useless rock into a soft, wet mash. She was giving him her water. She placed the soggy bread on the floor. Then, using her foot, she slowly, gently nudged it toward him. "It's okay," she crooned, her voice a soft lullaby. "This will be easier. You have to eat something. You have to keep your strength." Bear was trembling. He was trapped between a lifetime of military training that screamed stranger and danger and an animal instinct that recognized a pure, selfless act of compassion. He sniffed the air. He smelled the water. His growl subsided, replaced by a low, questioning whine muffled by the canvas. "That's it," Anya encouraged, staying perfectly still. "It's for you." Jake watched, his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Bear's black nose twitched. He leaned his head forward, a movement that clearly caused him a great deal of pain. He sniffed the offering, then slowly, his tongue darted out from under the muzzle, just far enough to touch the water-soaked bread. He licked it once, then again. His body was still rigid, but the growl was gone. He ate. Anya stayed kneeling for a long minute, just watching him, before she slowly stood and walked back to her spot, leaving her empty cup behind. Jake stared at her. His shoulder ached, his team was captive, and his mission was a catastrophic failure. He was a warrior, a SEAL, trained to solve problems with precision and force. But in this moment, his strength, his training, his very identity had been useless. He couldn't reach his own partner. This woman with no armor, no weapon, and nothing but a quiet, stubborn kindness had just broken through. She hadn't just given Bear food. She had given him her water. She had given him comfort. Jake looked back at Bear. The dog had finished the bread and had laid his head back down, but the trembling had eased, and the low, pained growl had finally, blessedly, stopped. Jake locked eyes with Anya across the dark, cold cellar. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of thanks, of awe. In a place where all faith had died, he had just witnessed an act of pure grace. And for the first time since the lights had snapped on in that alley, Jake Callahan felt a tiny, dangerous spark of hope. Anya's act of kindness had changed the atmosphere in the cell. It hadn't banished the fear, but it had punctured the suffocating despair. It was a single candle lit in a vast darkness, and for Jake, it was enough to see by. The fire in his shoulder still raged, but the fog of guilt in his mind had begun to clear. He was still a prisoner, but he was no longer just a victim. He was a SEAL, and a SEAL's job is to adapt, to overcome. His mind, once consumed by failure, now clicked back into its familiar, analytical rhythm. He began to work. His world became a grid of data points. The guard, the one who had struck him, was a creature of crude habit. Jake and his team dubbed him Cutter. Cutter was predictable. He arrived at 0600 and 1800, his boots heavy, his face a mask of bored cruelty. He never varied his routine. But Cutter wasn't the only one. There was a second guard, a much younger, thinner man with nervous eyes and a rifle he held too tightly, as if he were afraid of it. Gadget, in a moment of dark humor, had nicknamed him Twitch. Twitch was the night guard, and unlike Cutter, he was sloppy. He didn't check the corners. He stayed near the door, his gaze fixed on the hallway outside, as if he were more afraid of his superiors than his prisoners. Twitch was their weak link. Jake began to map the cellar, the heavy steel door, the single high grate which let in a sliver of moonlight, and the drip, drip, drip. That had been the first sound he'd heard. It came from the far wall, a dark corner piled high with old, rotted sacks. He wasn't the only one who had found a new purpose. Thorne, in a move of cold calculation, had recognized Anya's value. "The doctor," he had announced on the second day, his voice smooth. "You will tend to the others. We cannot have them dying before the cameras arrive." He had 2 guards escort her, their rifles trained on her as she moved from hostage to hostage. She checked Eleanor's makeshift bandage. She gave Gadget a precious clean strip of cloth for his leg, and in doing so, she became Jake's eyes and ears. Her movements were a masterpiece of covert communication. She knelt beside Gadget, who was deliberately positioned just feet from Jake. "His leg is infected," she said to the guard, her voice loud and clinical. "I need cleaner water." Then, as she pressed on the bandage, she whispered, her voice barely a breath, 2 guards, top of stairs. One sits, one patrols." When she tended to Eleanor in the far corner, she would rearrange the older woman's blanket. 1 fold meant 1 guard on the level above. 2 folds meant 2. But her most important work was with Bear. Thorne had surprisingly allowed it. "If the animal dies, it will stink," he'd said with a dismissive wave. She had a small plastic-wrapped first aid kit hidden in the sole of her boot, a last, desperate bit of forethought. Inside were a few antiseptic wipes, a small tube of antibiotic ointment, and 2 tablets of a powerful, non-drowsy painkiller. It was a treasure beyond price. Every morning after the guards left, she would go to Bear. The dog no longer growled at her. The moment she approached, his tail would give that same weak thump against the floor. He knew her. "Okay, handsome," she'd murmur, sitting on the filthy floor beside him, completely unbothered by the risk. "Let's see this." While Jake and his team created a wall with their bodies to shield her from the peephole, Anya went to work. She gently unwrapped the filthy rag. Jake saw the wound for the first time. It was deep. The shrapnel had torn the muscle, but it looked clean. Anya had been using her own tiny water ration to wash it. She crushed one of the painkillers and mixed it with the last of her water, letting Bear lick the paste from her palm. Then she applied the precious ointment to the wound. Finally, she took the last clean strip of fabric she had torn from the hem of her own shirt and expertly re-bandaged the leg, supporting it, immobilizing it. Bear let out a low, soft sigh and leaned his heavy head directly into her lap. He closed his eyes, trusting her completely. Jake watched, his throat tight. This woman, who possessed none of his strength or training, was proving to be tougher than his entire team. She was healing them. She was healing his partner. She was, he realized, healing him. The bond was no longer just between man and dog. It was a triangle: Jake, Anya, and Bear, a strange, silent family forged in the dark. On the 4th night, Anya brought the final piece of the puzzle. She was returning from the latrine bucket, her face pale. As she passed Jake, she stumbled, falling near his shoulder. Twitch, the nervous guard, yelled at her to get up but didn't approach. Anya braced herself with a hand on the wall next to Jake. "The pipe," she whispered, her voice shaking, but not with fear. "The one that drips, it's soft. The wall is soft." Jake's eyes snapped to the dark corner, the source of the drip, the place Twitch always avoided. Of course. It was an old, corroded drainage pipe. The wall behind it wasn't concrete. It was ancient, damp mortar. It was falling apart. He looked at Anya, who was pulling herself back up. She had confirmed it. He had the intel. He had the weakness. He had a team, battered but alive. He had a doctor who was as brave as any soldier he'd ever known. And he had his partner who, thanks to her, was now quiet, resting, and saving his strength. Jake settled back against the wall, the pain in his shoulder a dull, distant throb. He watched the shadows dance on the wall. The despair was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp, and patient anger. He would wait for the right moment. He would wait for Twitch to be on duty, for the night to be at its deepest. He caught Anya's eye from across the cellar. She was watching him, her expression hopeful, waiting. Jake held her gaze. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the shift. The beaten prisoner was gone. The seal was back. It was no longer a question of if. It was only a question of when. The 6th night in the cellar felt different. The air was colder, the silence deeper. Twitch, the nervous guard, had been on duty for 3 hours. He was predictable. He paced the hall for 5 minutes, then sat on a stool near the stairs for 10, his head buried in his phone, the blue light of the screen his only companion. Jake had timed him. He was in his 10-minute window. Jake, Gadget, and another teammate were huddled in the far corner near the source of the drip, drip, drip. The hostages, including Anya and Eleanor, formed a tight cluster near the center of the room, a faint prayer meeting, their low murmurs providing a perfect cover for the soft scrape, scrape, scrape of metal on mortar. Gadget, despite his throbbing leg, was the expert. He was using a small, sharpened piece of a bed frame that Jake had worked loose. For 2 nights, he had been patiently, silently digging at the soft mortar Anya had found. The rotted sewer pipe had kept the ancient wall permanently damp. The mortar crumbled like wet sand. Jake felt a tap on his arm. Gadget gave a single, slow nod. "It's time." Jake slid into the narrow opening they had created. It was a tight, agonizing squeeze for his injured shoulder. He pushed through, ignoring the pain, and dropped into a pitch-black, narrow space. It smelled of rust and decay, a maintenance tunnel, just as he'd hoped. He moved left, his hands reading the wall, until he found what he was looking for, a crude ladder leading up. He ascended into a dark hallway. He was outside the cellar. He was free. He moved with a silence born of 1,000 similar nights. He found Twitch, just as predicted, sitting on his stool, engrossed in his phone. Jake didn't hesitate. He closed the distance in 2 steps, one hand covering the guard's mouth, his forearm locking across his throat. Twitch's body went rigid with shock, his phone clattering to the floor. Jake held the pressure, a grim, necessary act. In seconds, the guard went limp. Jake gently lowered him to the ground, taking his rifle, sidearm, and the heavy ring of keys from his belt. He was armed. He moved to the cellar door, his heart hammering. He found the key, slid it into the heavy lock, and turned. The click of the tumblers was deafening in the silence. He pulled the heavy bar back and opened the door. For a second, his team just stared, their faces masks of disbelief in the dim hallway light. "Let's go," Jake whispered. His first move was to Bear. The dog was already on his feet, his body vibrating. Jake used a key to unlock the heavy chain, and it fell to the floor with a soft clink. Then he pulled his own knife, which he had kept secured flat against his spine, a last resort the guards had missed, and cut the hated canvas muzzle. The moment it fell away, Bear let out a low, joyous whine. He didn't jump. He just pressed his head hard against Jake's chest, a gesture of absolute, profound relief. His leg was still badly injured, but his eyes were bright. His ears were up. He was back. Jake armed his men with the guards' weapons. "Doc, get the civilians. Gadget, you're on point with me. Reaper, you have our 6. They moved as a single, silent unit. The operators formed a protective diamond around the 6 hostages. Anya was supporting Eleanor, who was whimpering in fear. Bear was at Jake's side, limping heavily but alert, his nose testing every shadow. They reached a junction in the hallway. This was the moment. As they stacked up, Jake turned to Anya. He pressed the knife he'd taken from Twitch into her hand, hilt first. "Just in case," he whispered. Anya looked down at the cold steel in her palm. For a second, she held it. Then she pushed it firmly back into his hand. "No," she whispered, her voice unshakable. "I save lives. You fight. That's how we win." Jake looked at her, this doctor who had faced down his dog, shared her water, and acted as his spy. He nodded, a deep respect settling in his chest. He was the shield, and she was the heart. "Stay close," he said. They found the stairwell. One more guard at the top. Reaper handled this one, a swift, silent takedown. They emerged into the ground floor of the plant. It was a vast, cavernous space filled with the silent, looming shapes of dead machinery. The moon, now higher in the sky, cast long, ghostly shadows through the shattered skylights across the wide, debris-strewn floor. Jake could see the large, open bay doors. The exit. Freedom. Almost there, he breathed. "Gadget, take the left. Ghost, you're on." Click. Whoosh. The entire factory floor was instantly, brutally illuminated. High-powered floodlights, identical to the ones from the alley, snapped on, mounted on the steel catwalks above them. "A predictable exit, Callahan," a smooth voice called out. Jake's blood ran cold. He looked up. Marcus Thorne was standing on the catwalk, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. He wasn't smiling. He looked disappointed. He had anticipated their escape. He had simply been waiting for them at the only possible door. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the huge space. He raised his rifle. Jake shoved Anya behind a large, rusted generator. "Get down." But Thorne wasn't aiming at Jake. His rifle was pointed lower, his gaze fixed on the animal at Jake's side. "The dog is the problem," Thorne stated calmly, as if discussing a math equation. "A symbol of the federal authority I despise." Jake saw the red laser sight appear. It wasn't on his chest. It was on Bear's. Bear saw the threat, too. He bared his teeth, a low, savage growl building in his chest, his body tensing to launch himself at the men above. "Bear, no!" Jake yelled. Time slowed. Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger. Anya, who had been helping Bear over a pile of rubble, was right beside him. She saw the red dot. She saw the rifle. She didn't hesitate. "No!" she screamed. Just as Thorne fired, Anya threw her entire body sideways, shoving the 90-pound dog with all her strength. The sound of the shot was deafening. Bear yelped, not in pain but in surprise, as he was knocked clear. The bullet intended for his heart found Anya instead. It slammed into her shoulder, spinning her around. She cried out, a sharp, choked sound, and crumpled to the concrete floor. "Anya!" Jake roared, his voice breaking. Before he could move, the 2 guards beside Thorne opened fire, a hail of automatic fire ripping through the air, forcing the operators back behind cover. Bear, safe but frantic, scrambled back to Anya, licking her face. In the chaos, Thorn moved, descending a metal staircase. He strode across the floor, grabbed the wounded, half-conscious Anya by the arm, and began to drag her back toward a fortified office block. "Stand down, Callahan," Thorn bellowed, pulling Anya against him as a human shield. "Another move from you or your animal, and she pays the price for your arrogance." Jake was pinned down. His team was trapped. Bear was safe. But Anya was in the hands of the enemy. The factory floor was a theater of chaos. The air, thick with cordite and pulverized concrete, rang with the sound of sustained suppressive fire from the catwalk. Thorn's men were pinning them down, their muzzle flashes like angry yellow stars in the artificial light. "Anya!" Jake roared again, but she was gone. Thorn had dragged her through a heavy steel door into an adjoining office block, the slam of its closing echoing like a death knell. "Saint, we're pinned!" Reaper yelled, his heavy machine gun barking back at the catwalk, the round sparking harmlessly against the steel supports. Jake's mind was a shard of ice. The panic was gone, replaced by a singular, cold objective. "Ghost," he yelled into his comm. "I don't care how. Silence that catwalk. Reaper, Gadget, cover me. Doc, stay with the civilians." He didn't wait for an answer. He moved. "Bear, with me." Jake sprinted across the open floor, a 20-yard dash through a gauntlet of incoming fire. Bullets snapped at his heels, one striking a spark on the generator he dived behind. Bear was right with him, limping heavily but running on pure adrenaline, a low, furious growl locked in his throat. Two sharp, precise cracks echoed from outside, different from the other gunfire. "Ghost." One of the catwalk floodlights exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging that side of the factory into shadow. The suppressive fire faltered. "He's hit." Catwalk left is down, Ghost's voice was calm. "Moving." Jake yelled. He reached the steel door. It was locked. Gadget was right behind him, slapping a small breaching charge onto the lock. Fire in the hole. The pop of the small charge was followed by the screech of tortured metal. Jake kicked the door open and plunged into the darkness of a concrete stairwell. "He's going for the roof," Jake spat, his voice tight. "It's the only high ground." They climbed, taking the stairs two at a time. Jake's injured shoulder screamed, but he ignored it. His world had narrowed to the woman he had failed. This was Helmond all over again. A bad call, a compromised position. He had saved Bear, yes, but only because she had sacrificed herself. He had traded her life for his dog's. The thought was a sickness in his gut. This wasn't a mission anymore. This wasn't about intel or objectives. This was about a debt. His mind was a storm of self-recrimination. He had seen the intel. He had admired her courage. He had watched her share her water with his dog. He had let her be his spy. And in the end, he had used her quiet strength as a tool, and it had gotten her captured. No more, he thought, his hand tightening on his rifle. Not again. He hit the top floor landing and slammed his boot into the thin metal door that led to the roof. It burst open. The scene that greeted him was stark, silent, and bathed in the cold, unforgiving light of the full moon. The factory roof was a flat expanse of gravel and tar. There was no escape, no helicopter, no rescue team. Just Thorn. He stood 10 yards from the roof's edge, his back to the night air. He held Anya in front of him, a rigid shield. His meticulous calm was gone. His tactical gear was rumpled, his face slick with sweat. He was a cornered animal, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. His pistol was pressed so hard against Anya's temple that it left a white circle on her skin. "No closer, Callahan." Thorn screamed, his voice cracking. "I swear I will do it." Jake stopped, his team fanning out behind him, their weapons raised. Gadget and Reaper took the left and right, but Thorn was smart. He was exposed. No cover, but also no angle. "Ghost, do you have a shot?" Jake whispered into his comm. Ghost's voice was strained. "Negative, Saint. He's using her as a perfect backstop. I've got the laser on his head, but it's on her head, too. I can't take it." Jake stood in the open, his rifle down but ready. He looked at Anya. She was a ruin. Her shirt was soaked, the blood a dark stain in the moonlight. She was trembling, not from the cold but from shock. But she was conscious, and she was looking right at him. Her eyes. He would never forget her eyes. They were filled with agony, with exhaustion, and with a terrifying, absolute trust. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading for her life. Her gaze was locked on his, and it held no doubt. It was a silent, desperate, and powerful command. "I know you are here." Do what you have to do. That unwavering faith was a heavier burden than any he had ever carried. It was a terrible, beautiful thing. He could not fail it. Drop your weapon, Callahan. Thorne shrieked, his composure shattering. Drop it. You cost me my men. You cost me my prize. Now you will pay. Drop it, or she dies. This was the test, the final, impossible choice. His training screamed at him, never give up your weapon. His heart screamed, save her. He looked at Bear. The dog was standing at his heel, his body a coiled spring, his good leg and 2 front paws bearing his weight. His wounded leg was off the ground, but he was balanced. He was locked onto Thorne, a low, murderous growl vibrating his entire frame. He was waiting. He, too, was looking at Jake, waiting for the one word, the one signal that would let him unleash his fury. Jake made his decision. He had his team. He had his rifle. But his true partner, the one who had started this all, was the animal at his side. Slowly, Jake began to raise his left hand, open, placating. All right, he said, his voice a calm, even baritone that cut through Thorne's panic. You're in control. I'm putting it down. It's over. He held Thorne's eyes, drawing the man's full, desperate attention. Thorne's pistol wavered just a fraction as he focused on his surrendering enemy. Jake's left hand was high and visible, but his right hand, still on the forestock of his rifle, was low, partially hidden by his own body. He made a small, almost invisible movement. It wasn't a signal for attack. It was the opposite. It was a subtle 3-finger tap against the polymer. Stand down. Hold. Wait for my mark. Bear's growl did not stop, but his body sank a fraction of an inch lower. He was a loaded weapon, his safety now engaged by his master. Jake took one deliberate, agonizingly slow step forward into the moonlight, making himself the bigger threat. Just let her go, he said. She's a civilian. Your fight is with me. The rooftop was silent, save for the wind, Anya's ragged breathing, and the low, steady growl of the dog who was waiting to save them all. The wind whipped across the rooftop, a cold, mournful sound. It was the only sound, save for the low, thrumming growl from Bear's chest. Thorne's eyes were locked on Jake, beads of sweat tracking through the grime on his face. He was a desperate man, his finger tightening, his arm trembling as he held Anya. You're in control, Jake repeated, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm of tension. He took one more slow, deliberate step, his left hand still raised, palm open. His right hand remained low, his fingers giving the silent hold command to Bear. He was now 10 yards away. Close enough. Just let her go, Jake said. And in that moment, he shifted his gaze from Thorne's eyes to the man's weapon hand. Thorne saw the shift. He flinched. No. Stay back. It was the opening Jake needed. Thorne. He roared, his voice a thunderclap that shattered the night. The name was a distraction. The real command was barked a millisecond later, a single, explosive syllable, now. The word was a release. The coiled spring unleashed. Bear, with a sound that was more of a roar than a bark, launched himself. He ignored his agonizingly painful leg, moving with a speed that was primal and terrifying. He didn't jump for the man's throat. He didn't go for the body. He did exactly as he had been trained. He attacked the threat. His jaws, powerful and precise, snapped shut on Thorne's right arm, the arm holding the pistol. Bear's entire 90-pound weight, combined with the force of his lunge, hit the arm like a battering ram. A high-pitched, inhuman scream tore from Thorne's throat. The pistol fired, a wild, harmless shot straight into the gravel as his arm was violently yanked down. The impact and the sudden dead weight of the dog broke Thorne's balance. He stumbled, spinning, his human shield no longer a shield. For 1/2 second, he was exposed, his body clear of Anya's. Crack. The sound was sharp, precise, and final. It came from the darkness beyond the factory, 500 yards away. Ghost. Thorne's head snapped back. The pistol clattered from his numb fingers. His eyes, wide with a final, terminal surprise, stared at the moon. He didn't fall. He simply collapsed, his strings cut, pulling Anya down with him. For a beat, the roof was silent. Jake didn't wait. He didn't check the threat. Reaper. Gadget. Secure. He yelled, already sprinting forward. He fell to his knees beside Anya, who had crumpled onto the cold gravel. Bear, panting heavily, his leg giving out, limped over and stood guard, nudging her face, whining. It's okay, Bear. Good boy. Stand down. Jake's voice was low, soothing, all the command gone, replaced by a desperate tenderness. He gently rolled Anya onto her back. Her eyes were closed, her face a pale, waxy white in the moonlight. Anya? Anya, can you hear me? He didn't wait for an answer. His hands, which had just been ready to end a life, were now impossibly gentle. He tore open the front of her shirt, his fingers probing, searching. His training took over. He was no longer a soldier. He was a medic. Okay, good, he murmured, mostly to himself. The bullet had struck her shoulder, a high-velocity wound. He found the entry, high near the collarbone. He gently felt her back. A clean exit. No shattered bone. It was painful. She had lost blood, but it wasn't fatal. He pulled his personal first aid kit from his vest, his movements economical, practiced. He tore open a pressure dressing. "You're okay, Anya," he whispered, pressing the bandage firmly against the wound. "You're safe. I've got you. You're safe now." Bear let out a low, soft whine and nudged his head under Anya's limp hand. At the touch of the dog's soft fur, her eyelids fluttered. Her gaze, hazy with pain, tried to focus. She saw the night sky, then the intense, worried face of the soldier leaning over her. Then she felt the familiar, warm head of the dog beside her. A small, weak smile touched her lips. "Bear," she whispered, her fingers weakly stroking his ear. I knew you'd come for him." Jake paused, his hand still applying pressure. He met her gaze. "He came for you, Anya," he said, his voice thick. "We both did." A new sound began to slice through the night air, a rhythmic whump 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 that grew louder by the second. A searchlight cut through the darkness, sweeping the roof. "That's for us," Jake said, a wave of profound relief washing over him. He looked over as Doc and the other hostages, escorted by Gadget, finally reached the roof. A state police helicopter roared overhead, then settled onto the wide, flat roof, its rotor wash tearing at them. The side door was open. Jake didn't hesitate. He finished securing the bandage, his hands gentle but firm. Then he slid one arm under her back and the other under her knees. He stood, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing. "Bear, hop," he commanded. Bear, with a final burst of energy, scrambled to his feet and with a powerful leap, jumped into the open door of the helicopter. Jake followed, carrying Anya, stepping into the vibrating, green-lit interior. Doc and his team helped the rest of the shaken, weeping hostages aboard. The moment they were clear, the pilot lifted off, the helicopter tilting as it climbed, leaving the dark, silent factory behind. The cabin was loud, chaotic. But in the center, there was a pool of calm. Jake sat on the floor, leaning against the bulkhead, cradling Anya in his arms. Her head rested against his uninjured shoulder, her body finally relaxing in the first moment of true safety she had known in days. Bear, his duty done, limped over. The dog didn't sit. He just collapsed in a heap, his body pressed against both of them, his heavy head settling onto Anya's lap. They flew out of the darkness. Jake looked down at the woman who had saved his dog and the dog who had saved them all. He gently took her good hand, his callous soldier's fingers lacing with her slender healer's ones. His other hand came to rest on Bear's head, scratching the soft fur behind his ears. He had walked into that town a man burdened by failure. He was leaving with a new family, forged in fire and bound by a quiet, unshakable faith. He had witnessed a quiet courage he had never known. And in the dark, cold cellar, through a simple gift of water, he had seen a miracle.